I watched my family's $22,000 winter stockpile turn into toxic ash, while 4 HOA board members smiled like they'd won. My 78-year-old mother's dementia routine shattered in seconds. Cheryl Kensington called it cleanup. The mountains called it consequences. If you believe bullies only win when good people stay silent, hit subscribe, because this is the kind of justice that comes with receipts. I had lived in the Colorado Rockies long enough to respect winter the way you respect a loaded firearm. Quietly, seriously, and without bravado. Pine Valley sat high enough that storms didn't visit. They moved in, unpacked, and stayed for months. When the first real blizzard rolled through, the roads disappeared, cell service blinked out, and the outside world became a rumor. Up here, survival wasn't a hobby. It was math, routine, and repetition. That was why I started prepping in August. I ran heavy equipment for most of my adult life, and the job rewired my brain. Every breakdown had a cause. Every emergency had a prevention. I had learned to stock parts before a machine failed, to stage fuel before a storm hit, to keep redundancy because the mountains didn't care about optimism. My mother's dementia made that discipline more than personal preference. It made it life support. My mother, Sarah, had been slipping for years. Some days she recognized me immediately. Some days she called me by my father's name and asked why the wallpaper looked different, even though it hadn't changed in decades. The only thing that steadied her was consistency. The same labels, the same bins, the same shelf order for medication, the same place for the warm blankets and the glucose tabs and the emergency lanterns. In her mind, routine wasn't comfort, it was orientation. The community around us had been built in the mid-'80s around a man-made lake. People moved up for the views, the quiet, the bragging rights. Most of them didn't understand the land's history. They saw a pretty shoreline and assumed it belonged to whoever paid the HOA dues. They didn't know my grandfather had sold acreage to developers but kept what mattered. Water rights and spillway control that were written into a 1962 deed like a signature that never faded. For decades, the arrangement had been simple. The lake stayed stable. The spillway got maintained. People enjoyed the scenery. Then Cheryl Kensington arrived. Cheryl didn't walk like a neighbor. She moved like an administrator. Everything about her looked curated. Outerwear too expensive for mud. Smile too practiced for sincerity. Voice sweet enough to hide sharp edges. She gathered a board around her that mirrored her priorities. Trevor with his oversized house and improvements that seemed to multiply without permits. Marissa handling money while renting out her place to tourists. Douglas managing community standards like a business plan. Their properties were gorgeous on paper. Their ethics weren't. At first, they targeted harmless things. A shed too visible. A woodpile not aesthetic. A generator creating noise. It always sounded small until you realized the pattern. Pressure applied to residents who didn't have the time or money to fight. Meanwhile, the board's own homes expanded, upgraded, and bent rules without consequences. Standards weren't standards. They were weapons. I kept my head down because I had one priority. My mother. I used my land to stage supplies discreetly, organized and protected from wildlife, with fuel stored correctly and paperwork in order. I had spent months building that stockpile: food, propane, medical backup, water treatment, heating redundancies, the kind of planning that made winter survivable when the nearest help could be hours or days away. On October 23rd, I drove my mother to Denver for a specialist appointment that couldn't wait. It was a long day, the kind that drained both of us. She had a rare good stretch on the drive back, and the small normalcy felt like a gift. I let myself imagine a winter where we were simply safe and quiet. We pulled into the driveway in late afternoon and the smell hit first. It wasn't campfire smoke. It was acrid, chemical, and wrong. I saw gray haze rising from the back of the property, and then I saw the glow. My stomach locked up before my feet moved. The pit I used for occasional brush was active, but this was not brush. This was melted plastic, scorched metal, and the sickening stench of burned medical packaging. My mother's reaction came like a tremor. She began to cry before she could even name why. Her body knew what her mind struggled to hold. Something essential had been violated. Her hands shook, and she started asking for her medication box in a voice that sounded like panic wrapped in confusion. for cars sat out front like they were attending a ceremony. Cheryl and the board stood near the burn area with clipboards and smug, satisfied posture. Their faces didn't show concern or urgency. They looked entertained, like they had come to watch something collapse and enjoy the moment it did. They framed it as an emergency hazard cleanup. They treated my winter stockpile like trash. They called it unsafe storage. They implied the community had been endangered. And while they performed their righteousness, my family's preparation vanished into ash. I scanned for notice, any real warning, any legal document, anything that made this remotely legitimate. But the timing told the truth. We had left early. The notice they claimed existed wasn't there when we departed. It was the oldest trick in petty bureaucracy. Declare an emergency, skip procedure, act fast, and dare the victim to prove what didn't happen. Standing there, I didn't just feel angry. I felt the cold kind of anger that becomes focus. I looked at the destroyed supplies and thought about the blizzard forecast that would arrive within days. I thought about my mother's confusion turning into danger the moment routine broke. I thought about Cheryl's smile, how she enjoyed this. Then I thought about my grandfather's deed, the spillway controls, and the fact that the lake everyone worshipped wasn't theirs in the way they believed. The board had tried to cripple me before winter. They had accidentally reminded me what leverage looked like in the mountains. The next morning, the paperwork war began like a coordinated strike. It wasn't one complaint. It was many, arriving from different directions, each one engineered to drain time and money. A health complaint about storage, a fire concern about propane, a building code issue about generator wiring, an environmental complaint about fuel containers. Each notice carried fines and escalating penalties, the kind designed to force a quick surrender. That was when I stopped thinking of it as HOA drama and started thinking of it as a system. I had spent years working alongside inspectors and code officials on job sites. I knew what legitimate enforcement looked like. It involved site visits, documented hazards, and due process. This didn't. This looked like weaponized bureaucracy. Complaints filed strategically, time to hit when a caretaker was already overwhelmed, stacked so the costs multiplied before anyone could breathe. In Pine Valley, isolation was an accelerant. An hour to the nearest bigger town. Limited suppliers. Limited relationships. When you lost goodwill, you lost access. Cheryl understood that, so she used narrative the way other people used snowplows. Within weeks, neighbors who used to wave began avoiding eye contact. Local businesses got nervous. A pharmacy suddenly wanted additional verification. A hardware store acted cautious about selling supplies that were normal for mountain winters. The message wasn't subtle. I was being socially quarantined, painted as unstable and unsafe. My mother took the hardest hit. Dementia didn't understand politics. It understood safety and habit. She kept asking where her labeled boxes went, where the familiar bins had been placed, why the shelves looked wrong. She began waking at night, unsettled, searching for items that no longer existed. I rebuilt what I could, but winter prep wasn't just buying replacements. It was time. It was organization. It was consistency. They had burned not only supplies, they had burned predictability. I documented everything. I photographed the remains, logged costs, kept records of notices and dates, and preserved every written claim they made. If Cheryl wanted to declare emergency abatement, she had to be accountable for what she destroyed. I tracked the board's actions like I tracked equipment maintenance, because patterns mattered more than emotions. Then I went to the courthouse. Dusty property records were the mountain version of scripture. They didn't care about personality. They cared about ink. I pulled development filings, plats, flood maps, and the original land transactions. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. The community's shared lake had boundaries that were never as simple as the board pretended. And the spillway, where lake levels were controlled, had been reserved by my family in a way that had never been transferred. The most important discovery wasn't just that we retained rights. It was that board members had built as if those rights didn't exist. Their lakefront mansions sat in places that made sense only if you ignored the older flood designations. Some of their property improvements depended on assumptions about water management staying tame and predictable, assumptions that weren't theirs to make. The mountains didn't care about their assumptions. The mountains cared about snowpack, melt rate, and safe drainage. I kept digging. I started looking beyond my conflict and into their pattern with others. HOA records, property transfers, and public filings told a story that felt ugly and familiar. Vulnerable residents had been pressured, fined, isolated, and then rescued through a buyout. Those homes didn't vanish into the open market. They transferred into the hands of a shell entity with connections that always seemed to circle back to the same names. A land grab didn't look like a heist in the mountains. It looked like a spreadsheet and a committee vote. And Cheryl's board looked like it had been running that machine for years. The deeper I went, the more I recognized the real reason they targeted me. I wasn't just an eyesore. I wasn't just a caretaker with supplies. I was a complication. I lived on older rights. I had documents they didn't control. I had a family name tied to the infrastructure beneath their pretty scenery. Their cleanup wasn't about safety. It was about breaking me before I could break their story. Faith didn't mean much to Cheryl. She treated rules like costumes she wore when convenient. But I had grown up with a different kind of mountain belief, the kind that says you don't mistreat the helpless, you don't steal what isn't yours, and you don't put a thumb on the scale and call it community. People like Cheryl called it governance. Up here, we called it sin dressed in paperwork. I built a case file quietly, the same way you build a foundation. Measured, reinforced, and impossible to dispute. I gathered deeds. I gathered logs. I gathered evidence of selective enforcement. I gathered the names of residents who had been pushed out. I gathered the board's financial fingerprints where they didn't expect anyone to look. Winter pressed in harder. The air sharpened, and the lake surface began to skim with ice in the mornings. Snow piled up on the ridgelines. My mother's anxiety rose and fell like weather, unpredictable and exhausting. And underneath it all, I felt one calm certainty settle in my bones. If they wanted to play with survival, the mountains were going to teach them what survival meant. By late winter, Cheryl escalated again, not with fines but with an attempt to take control. She framed it as concern for my mother. She used the language of welfare, safety, and community responsibility. It sounded righteous to outsiders. It sounded like protection. But I heard the same old melody underneath. Remove the obstacle, seize the asset, and call it public service. Outside agencies got pulled in. Not because anyone had actually witnessed neglect, but because paperwork makes strangers real. A concerned report looks legitimate until you realize it came from the same small circle of people who had already burned the medical supplies they claimed to worry about. I cooperated because I wasn't afraid of truth. I showed records of care, medication schedules, appointment history, home safety updates, emergency plans, the kind of documentation that caretakers learn to keep because the world asks for proof even when love should be obvious. The social worker saw stability, not danger. My mother's condition didn't need a courtroom. It needed calm. Cheryl's narrative didn't land the way she wanted, so she leaned harder on legal threats. A property seizure petition appeared like a blade, sharp, dramatic, designed to intimidate. It was a desperate move, and desperation has a smell. It smelled like fear pretending to be authority. That was when my attorney delivered the piece that changed everything. Not just confirmation of our spillway authority, but the implications of how it intersected with flood zone compliance. The board's homes weren't simply close to the lake. They were positioned in a way that only worked if key elevation and flood representations were accepted as true. If those representations were false, then their insurance posture, permits, and tax treatment looked questionable at best. I didn't need to prove every angle on day one. I needed to be ready for the moment everything snapped into focus. Spring snowpack that year was heavy, historically heavy. The kind of winter that looks beautiful until you realize it's storing power in every drift and ridgeline. When the warm spell comes, that stored winter doesn't melt politely. It surges. For 4 decades, my family had managed that spillway with a simple philosophy. Protect downstream residents first. We didn't punish anyone with water. We didn't treat it like a weapon. We treated it like responsibility because water has no morals. It just follows physics. That was why the deed mattered. It wasn't a loophole. It was an obligation embedded in the land's history. I pulled my family's maintenance logs and operational notes, the boring paper trail that becomes priceless in disputes. I photographed baseline lake levels. I recorded weather patterns. I documented the snowpack statistics and melt projections from official sources. The more I prepared, the more Cheryl's behavior looked reckless. She was trying to seize control of water management from the one household that had been doing it responsibly for generations. Her board had no interest in flood safety. They had interest in control. The final insult came when I learned they had booked long, luxurious winter escapes, leaving their properties unattended through the harshest months while preaching community safety at meetings. Their emergency plans were credit cards and plane tickets. Their morality was convenience. Meanwhile, my mother couldn't escape her own mind. She depended on me. She depended on routine. She depended on the very supplies they had burned as if they were trash. I didn't dream of revenge as violence. I dreamed of justice as exposure. The kind that makes people see clearly. The kind that makes bullies lose the cover they hide behind. The kind that makes consequences arrive not because someone broke laws, but because someone stopped protecting them from reality. As the warm spell approached, my attorney and I aligned on one principle. Whatever happened needed to remain inside lawful operation. The spillway would be managed according to established protocols for extreme melt conditions, with proper documentation. If the lake required a drawdown for safety, it would happen. If certain properties had been built where they should not have been, that was not the spillway operator's crime. That was the builder's. Cheryl kept pushing for the hearing date, convinced she was closing in. She didn't realize she had timed her power play to the same calendar the mountains used. The first big melt. In the last week before the hearing, my mother had a rare lucid moment. She stared out toward the lake and asked, with surprising steadiness, if spring water was coming hard this year. She didn't remember what she'd eaten, but she remembered the mountain rhythms that had shaped her life. I told her the truth. The melt was coming, and I had a responsibility to do what my grandfather had always done, manage it properly. Cheryl thought that meant I was trapped. In reality, it meant the most honest authority on the mountain was about to speak. An honest authority doesn't need a clipboard. The day of the hearing arrived with that strange, bright warmth that feels out of place after a long winter. The air smelled of thawing earth and distant runoff. Snow still sat deep in the shaded places, but the sun had started the slow liquidation of months of accumulation. It was the kind of morning that looked peaceful while quietly building force. I had already begun responsible spillway adjustments earlier in the week, documented and measured, consistent with historical melt management. I followed the same steps my grandfather taught me. Steady releases, careful monitoring, downstream checks, no surprises. It was boring work to people who didn't understand water. To me, it was safety. Cheryl wanted drama. I wanted procedure. At the community center, she arrived dressed like a performance. Composed, confident, ready to tell a story where she was protector and I was threat. She used my mother's condition like a prop, framing herself as the defender of an elderly resident while ignoring that she had supervised the burning of that elderly resident's essential supplies. It wasn't just cruelty. It was hypocrisy polished into a speech. The room held people who had watched the board terrorize residents for years and people who had stayed silent because silence was easier than conflict. But silence shifts when enough proof accumulates. The months of documentation had weight. The pattern of enforcement had shape. The record of buyouts had a trail. Then the calls started. Not mine. Theirs. Board members' faces changed one by one. The way people look when something expensive is breaking and they can't pretend it isn't happening. Their posture tightened. Their eyes flicked away. Panic rose behind their expressions like a tide. Spring melt was doing what spring melt always did, moving toward low ground. Proper spillway management was doing what it was meant to do, protecting downstream infrastructure by controlling lake levels and runoff flow. Storm systems and drainage paths that had existed long before their renovations were responding to physics, not prestige. Cheryl's performance cracked as she realized the mountains didn't care about her narrative. For years, her board had acted as if they owned the lake. as if the spillway was a decorative feature, as if the flood easement zones were negotiable. They had built and renovated and expanded under the assumption that authority could be purchased, documented, or faked into existence. Now water was reminding them what easement really meant. When panic hit, it hit fast. The board attempted to pivot the hearing into an emergency. They wanted immediate action, immediate restraint, immediate intervention, as if urgency could rewrite decades of deeds and hydrology. But their urgency had always been selective. They had declared my supplies an emergency hazard while ignoring their own unpermitted expansions. They had weaponized agencies against me while insulating themselves with status. Now their status was being tested against reality. The hearing didn't end with shouting. It ended with exposure. The attention shifted from my property to their pattern. Questions rose about why vulnerable residents kept being pushed out, why the same shell entity kept buying, why board members profited, why the safety crusade always targeted people who couldn't fight back. The veneer of community service peeled away, and underneath it was greed wearing a badge. Officials who had been neutral became interested when they saw documentation instead of emotion. That was the thing Cheryl never understood. Fear works on neighbors. It doesn't work on paper trails. Paper trails are the language of consequences. In the days that followed, investigations accelerated. Not because of gossip, but because patterns like this, systematic targeting of the elderly, coordinated financial pressure, concealed conflicts, are the kind that attract serious scrutiny. Cheryl's board had behaved like they were untouchable because HOA power feels like a small kingdom when nobody checks the books. But the mountains had already delivered the first lesson. Winter didn't care about their luxury. Spring didn't care about their plans. And a deed didn't care about their titles. My mother's routine slowly rebuilt. I replaced what I could. I reorganized the shelves to match what her mind remembered. I kept the labels consistent. I sat with her through the restless nights and reminded her, again and again, that she was safe. She forgot the explanations, but she remembered the calm in my voice. That mattered. Justice, in the end, wasn't the sight of people panicking. Justice was the restoration of safety for the vulnerable. Justice was the end of a system that fed on exhaustion. Justice was the truth walking into daylight and refusing to leave. I didn't celebrate ruin. I celebrated accountability. Because in the mountains, survival isn't just about stockpiles and fuel. It's about the kind of community you build when the storms come, one that protects the weak, or one that exploits them. Cheryl Kensington had chosen exploitation. And when you choose that in the Rockies, the land eventually answers. Not with rage, with consequences. And those consequences always arrive with the same quiet certainty as spring melt. Inevitable, measurable, and impossible to argue with.